Good morning. We're here today at the Sacramento City Cemetery. My name is Tina, and we're going to be telling you some stories today about some of the residents here in the cemetery. It was established 1849 with a gift of land from John Sutter to the city of Sacramento of the original 10 acres, and there's somewhere between 25 and 40,000 individuals buried here. And we're going to, most of these stories are pretty sad, pretty gruesome in some cases, but every single one of them, just because these individuals no longer are living, it does not mean that their story should not live in their place. So gird your loins. We're getting ready by telling a story of death. And this particular person, her name was Mary Jane Bugbee, and Mary Jane Bugbee lived with her husband in an area of the Sacramento Valley called Mormon Island. And Mormon Island was established by the Mormon Church as a colony there during the gold rush, now where Folsom Lake resides. And right now we're in a drought, so you can actually see a lot of Mormon Island. But Mary Jane was a fashionista. She loved to go shopping, and she loved to ride side saddle on a horse. And her husband, whose name was Benjamin Norton Bugbee, he was a Sacramento sheriff and a council member, and they called him the Champagne King because they also owned a winery called the Bugbee Winery, and he grew special grapes that just made fantastic champagne. But as I was telling you, Mary Jane, she loved to go shopping. Now, at this particular time, there was a train that went from the station in Folsom, California, all the way down the main line to here to Sacramento. And one day, Mary Jane decides to go shopping. Her husband puts her on the saddle of her horse, and she is sitting side saddle. The unfortunate thing is the dress of choice at this time was hoop skirts. Now, there were many people that favored the wide hoops that would sometimes bring 4 to 5 feet in diameter around the body, with small hoops at the top and then growing in the petticoat to a very large hoop by the time you got to the bottom of the petticoat. And then there was a type that Mary Jane preferred, which was a single coil hoop. It started very small at the waistline, in a coiling motion sewn into the petticoat, would get larger and larger and larger as it got to the very bottom of the petticoat. Mary Jane, that particular day, is wearing one of those single coil petticoats. She's side saddle on a horse. Her husband puts her on the horse. She grabs hold of the saddle horn, and they start their journey. Now, about a quarter of a mile into this journey, that horse got spooked. He reared up a little. Her husband grabs a firm hold of the reins. Mary Jane grabs a firm hold of the saddle horn, settles the horse back down, and they start again. About another quarter of a mile or so into their journey, the horse got spooked once more, and this time it rears way up into the air. Mary Jane goes back. She can't grab the saddle horn. Her husband cannot grab a firm hold of the reins. The horse takes off, and Mary Jane's petticoat grabbed hold of the saddle horn as she unraveled onto the ground. So for the next 500 to 800 feet that the horse traveled, Mary Jane's head hit every rock and stone before the horse was finally settled down. And they say, according to newspaper records, that there wasn't a lot left of her face in order to be identified, other than maybe a dental type of recognition at this point. So that, my friends, is a tragic end to the slave to fashion Mary Jane Bugbee, our fashion victim. All right, so now we're going to continue on. We're going to now talk about a different type of death. We're making our way around here, a little bit shadier location for a few minutes. We're going to talk about a man who was born on the other side of the country in the state of New York. His name was William Stephen Hamilton. Now, Most people have never even heard of William Stephen, but they all know who his dad was, and his father was Alexander Hamilton. Now, by the time William Stephen is born, Hamilton has had some very bad financial debts that have cleaned out most of their savings at this point. William Stephen is born in 1803 to almost abject poverty in one form or another. His father is killed in the very famous duel with Aaron Burr, and now the family is very much destitute. So when William Stephen is growing up, he doesn't have a very good image of his father. So by the time he is a young man, he makes his way across the United States, and in the states of Illinois and Indiana, he is a army officer fighting in a lot of the Indian wars at that particular time. And according to what people have said through actual personal records, they said, well, he was not a very good-looking man compared to his father. Now, his father, according to the $10 bill, was a very handsome man. William Stephen was more gruff and rough around the edges. So he gets to California in 1849. We all know what is already underway in Northern California at this time, the gold rush. William Stephen makes his way all the way up to the Chico area, California, where he tries panning for gold up there. Probably made a little bit of money with the gold he found. He comes down to Sacramento by 1850. We all know what's happening here in Sacramento in 1850. If it's not one thing or it's another, we have the cholera epidemic. And William Stephen Hamilton caught cholera and died. And because no one knew who he was, he didn't go around announcing, my father was one of the founding fathers. Well, they buried him in an unmarked grave. But there was an organization already forming in the United States by this time called the Daughters of the American Revolution. And they found out who this young man was. And they made sure not only to find out where he was buried, but let's put a monument because of who his father was. So even though he tried his best to escape the history of his father and his not so good financial doings in his later part of his life, it has his father's likeness right on the front of the monument. So he doesn't even get a chance to say who he was. He's his father's son, Alexander Hamilton, and is cared for by the local chapter of the DAR, can't even say it straight. But these individuals honor any of the Revolutionary Wars, particular residents that were fighting battles on the other side of the country. They make sure that those families and those legacies are always remembered. So William Stephen Hamilton. Let's make our way down this way and we'll do another story. Now, a lot of people think, well, everybody that died here and buried here must have also died here. Well, not always the case. My next story for you is a woman that died in San Francisco. Her name was Josephine Friedman. And let's go over by the funeral chapel to top off this story. Watch your step, Jared. So Josephine Friedman was born in Sacramento, but she was kind of an odd duck. And in the 1880s, she moved all the way to San Francisco. And in that particular area of San Francisco, she was down by Market Street. A lot of the buildings there were 3 or 4 stories, so those were pretty tall buildings, even in that time. And Josephine Friedman, according to the local newspapers there in San Francisco, was considered a crank spiritualist. In other words, she considered herself a medium. She could communicate with the dead and spirits, and she was kind of an odd duck, but people, well, they thought maybe she actually was legitimate in all of her claims. And In one evening in 1889, Josephine came to a very tragic end. But it's not like you would think. Now, Josephine lived on the third story of a three-story building. And one night she gets into her bed and she goes to sleep, and for some reason something wakes her up. And according to those that passed by, Josephine walks to her window, throws it up, she looks out like this, and she jumped out onto the street below, lands on her head facing up. Now, someone has seen this happen, so they call for medical personnel. They call for people to come and help her. She is laying facing up, and she is still conscious. But she's kind of babbling and acting kind of funny, and a doctor comes along, and he asks her, "What happened? Why did you fall? Were you pushed out?" And Josephine said, "Yes, I was called to the window by the spirits. And the spirits, once I got to the window, I looked out and they shoved me out the window onto the street below." And she, at the end of her time, in the next couple of minutes, kept saying over and over again, "Out the window, out the window, out the window." Now, she's buried somewhere here, but there is no headstone for her that we have been able to find. That's just one of the weird stories of someone who died a very tragic death under such unusual circumstances. Josephine Friedman. Let's move along. Now, the next story I have for you is a story of murder. Now, this particular person was not a very nice guy. His name was Frederick Rowe, and Frederick Rowe was a local gambler in the saloons and card rooms in the area that we now call Old Sacramento. And at one time there was a building there at the corner of 2nd and J Streets called the Mansion House. And one particular evening in 1854, Frederick Rowe is sitting at a table. He's playing several of the card games that were popular at the time, whether it was Spanish Monte or Faro, and he is cheating a lot of men out of their hard-earned money. Now, in walks a second individual. This person's name was Charlie Myers. Now, Charlie Myers was a well-liked member of Sacramento society. He was just the best guy. Everyone would say, "Hey, Charlie, how you doing?" So he's very well liked. He walks into the saloon, he walks over to the bar, he gets himself a beer, and he sits down and eyeballs what's going on at Frederick Rowe's table. Now, Frederick Rowe, while he was gambling, was also known to get highly inebriated or drunk while he's playing. He was also rumored to always carry in the waistcoat of his vest a pistol. And this particular evening, he is bilking one man after another out of their hard-earned money, and Charlie Myers, for a time, watches and starts to get extremely upset at what is going on. And finally, he's had enough. He stands up and he says, "Frederick Rowe, you need to stop cheating all of these men out of their hard-earned money." The saloon goes silent. Everyone's eyes are on Frederick Rowe. Frederick Rowe, once again, he's been drinking. He stands up and he's a little shaky. He reaches into the pocket of his vest and he pulls out his pistol. And Charlie Myers can see that he is now aiming that pistol right at Charlie Myers, who now turns and tries to run away. Now, he doesn't get very far before Frederick Rowe pulls the trigger of the pistol and gets Charlie Myers right between the spine and one of his shoulder blades. And down on the ground of the saloon goes Charlie Myers. Now, it's a very crowded saloon, so everyone says, "Let's get the sheriff." They get the sheriff. The sheriff puts Charlie Myers in a doctor's office to be attended to his wound, and now he takes Frederick Rowe to the local jail. Now, Frederick Rowe is in the jail, and they're trying to decide what to do with him, because It's a very crowded saloon. There were a lot of witnesses. They all say the same thing. Frederick Rowe did this. Frederick Rowe did this. But did he do it because he was drunk, or did he do it because he really had an angry resentment towards Charlie Myers? They're waiting for someone to come along, a judge or someone to officiate at what they're going to do with Frederick Rowe. Meanwhile, for several hours' time, Charlie Myers is in a doctor's office and he's still alive. Imagine. Now, meanwhile, outside of the jail, there's a lynch mob forming. And they all have one thing in mind. They want to hang him, so they start saying, "Hang him! Hang him! Hang Frederick Rowe!" And it's going on. And the sheriff is getting very, very tense and nervous at what to do. And pretty soon, he decides to fold under pressure for all that is going on. Charlie Myers is still alive in the doctor's office. And now, where there's this great big arena that we called the Golden One Center, at one time that used to be a large grove of great big fat oak trees with great big fat branches. They take Frederick Rowe to that particular grove of oak trees. They place a chair underneath the branch, throw a rope over the limb, put the noose around Frederick Rowe's neck. They ask him if he has any last words. He has nothing to say. So they pull the rope tight, kick that chair out from underneath Frederick Rowe, and he hung for about 5 or 6 minutes before he was legally declared deceased. Meanwhile, back of the doctor's office, Charlie Myers was still alive at the time of this hanging and would pass away several hours afterwards. Now, how many times have you ever heard of a man convicted of the murder of another man, sentenced to death for that murder, while the man he has murdered is still alive and breathing at the time he has been sentenced to death and hung? Only in Sacramento. Let's continue on. It's a good day for death and murder. Now, I have another story for you about a woman that was a businesswoman here in Sacramento. She actually was born Sarah Brown, and she had a sister that came out with her in 1849 to Sacramento, who we know familiar here in the city of Sacramento as one of our many professional women, as Fanny Seymour. Now, her name was Mary McCormick, and Mary McCormick ran a house of ill repute, or brothel, or whatever you used to call, in this particular part of Sacramento, close to what we call the downtown Commons area. And she is very well known by the residents of the city of Sacramento. She has changed her name over years. She was married one time when she was still back east, and she somehow got the name of McCormick from the first man she was rumored to be married to. That name stuck with her. So even though she married several other men, the last man she married, his last name was Wilson, she was still known professionally as Mary McCormick. So her sister also ran a brothel on 2nd Street in Old Sacramento at that time. So there's two women, there's reportedly sisters, and they both have that same profession. Now, Mary McCormick was also kind of one of those that was very much into spiritualism. She had several children that she gave birth to, one that ended up dying back east before they actually came out to California, and then another child, and that particular child died at the age of 17, so pretty young. So Mary McCormick, she is in her advancing years, and when I say advancing years, she's not 70 or 80, she's in her 40s. That was an advancing year, especially if you were a woman of professional status at that particular time. So Mary McCormick, she's in her late 40s. She believes that the man she is married to now is trying to poison her. So she goes to one of her other men that she was reportedly married to. She asks him if she can stay with him for a while. He says, yeah, you can kind of sleep here, but that's about it. You're not staying with me. So she's kind of there. And one particular evening, she ends up passing away of coronary thrombosis. Now, Mary McCormick was a prostitute, but she was also extremely wealthy and very money-wise. In fact, so many of the women that were prostitutes at this particular time knew how to invest their money, usually by the help of the men that were their clients, or their friends, if you choose to call it that. But Mary McCormick had a lot of money, so when she passed away, she had already built a huge mausoleum here in the city cemetery that cost, at the time of her death, $16,000. Now, in today's money, that's more like, several $100,000 worth of money. And imagine such a huge mausoleum, and there's Mary buried there, and several of her relatives are buried there with her. But Fannie Seymour, her sister, ended up disappearing from the Sacramento area, and we believe that she moved back to somewhere in the New Orleans area of Louisiana. But it's not for certain. We have never found a headstone for her. But Mary McCormick died a very sorrowful death after being so afraid of her husband trying to poison her. It probably caused her to have a heart attack. And that is Mary McCormick's story. Now, we've got a couple more. Let's head on up this way. All right, so now we've got probably the best story to tell you. And as we're walking towards that monument, I can tell you a little bit about the other people that are buried in this cemetery. We have a Donner Party survivor buried here by the name of Philippine Keseberg. Her husband was probably the most notorious member of the Donner Party. His name was Louis Keseberg, and they say that at the time that they made their way to the Donner Lake area, and everyone else gets rescued except for Louis Keseberg and reportedly Tamsen Donner, who has stayed behind to care for her dying husband, George. Well, when they come to rescue Louis Keseberg, Tamsen Donner is nowhere to be found. So they have now put the moniker on him as being someone that eats people or a cannibal. Whether or not that's 100% true, all we know is that she was nowhere to be found, no remains, no nothing. And later in his life, he was reportedly someone that wrote a letter of apology to the Donner children, apologizing for everything that happened. So you can use your own judgment on that particular one. But we're going to now tell a story of the death of one of Sacramento's many residents of German persuasion by the name of Maria Rupp. Now, Maria Rupp was born in the Hesse region of Germany in the year 1832. And she came to California in 1856. So imagine at this particular time, a young woman coming to the other side of the world from an area where they didn't speak any English or very little English to begin with. But according to the Sacramento Daily Union, she was extremely beautiful. So she gets a job running a saloon between 3rd and 4th Street on K, underneath that thing we all call the god-awful I-5 freeway now. And she is beautiful. She runs the saloon. She is also the entertainment in the saloon. So she knew how to sing beautifully, and she could play the piano. That meant that every night when men are in that saloon, they're looking at that beautiful woman, and she's singing maybe Oh Susanna or another Stephen Foster song like Camptown Races. These were very popular tunes at this time. And men would just pour out money, another drink, another round, another round. Maria is singing. She's also engaged to a local doctor by the name of Francois Noisette. Now, everyone knows this in Sacramento, except for one man. Now, his name was Peter Metz, and Peter Metz was a local carpenter here in Sacramento, and he did an honest day's work every single day, but he was kind of weird and kind of strange. There were many times that he was reported to have walked around and talked to himself and muttered things, and people would just say, well, you know, that's just Peter being Peter. He's an okay guy. Let's not worry about that. Well, one day he voices his opinion that he is in love with Maria and he wants to marry her. Everyone says you can't marry her. She's already engaged to be married to Francois Noisette. And Peter makes a very bold statement. If I can't marry her, no one can. On the night of November 18th, 1857, Maria is in the saloon. She's at the piano. She's playing a song. Everyone has a beer or a whiskey singing along with her. And in walks Peter Metz. And he has a butcher knife in his hand. Now, everyone's having a good time, so maybe that is why they didn't notice the butcher knife. He walks into the saloon. He sits down on the piano bench next to Maria. He puts his arm around her, and he took that knife and drove it up underneath her right breast, into her ribs, and into her spleen. Now, very crowded saloon. She's laying on the floor bleeding out, so there's no way Peter Metz can say, I didn't do it. He probably said, look what I did. I stopped her from marrying that other man. Well, this is California. And even then, that particular time, you're going to have a long trial to determine whether or not this person was sane at the time they committed the crime. And of course, they did find Peter Metz guilty of murder. Now, in the state of California, we just built a brand new prison between 1854 and 1855 called San Quentin. And that is where Peter Metz was sent. And he's there for years, years, years. By the time that the governor of California at this time, Newton Booth, is up for re-election, well, he decides he's going to have to make some clever moves in order to guarantee himself a spot for re-election. Peter Metz puts in a petition saying he wants to be released because he's been a model prisoner there for over 10 years at the prison. In fact, the longest inmate serving a term in that particular point in their history of that prison. And so the governor says, well, too bad. You did something extremely heinous. I'm not releasing you. Well, he then gets up for re-election and loses that re-election, and he thinks it's because, this is Newton Booth I'm talking about, thinks it's because he didn't release Peter Metz when he should have. And now that's the end of Peter Metz part of the story, but now let's talk about Maria Rupp. When she died, there were 23 carriages for the funeral procession full of flowers and mourners, making their way all the way to the city cemetery. And now we have her being buried in the ground. We have the local doctor by the name of Francois Noisette. He is now in a grieving state. And unfortunately for Francois Noisette, he only outlived Maria by 4 years. Now, most doctors, when they entered the profession of being a doctor at this particular time, would make out a will. If they were to die early for unknown reasons or for whatever type of reasons, that all of their bodies and parts would be dedicated to medical research and science. So it would all be not buried in the ground, but would be used for whatever kind of medical research. But Francois made sure one part of his body would be buried next to Maria. In the city cemetery, there's a tiny little headstone next to Maria's granite cross, all about how beautiful she was and what a large contribution she made to the city of Sacramento. On it, written in one little sentence, it says, "My heart lies with Maria." And that's all that's left of that story. And that's all that's left of the time we have here today in the city cemetery. I hope you enjoyed strolling with me and making sure that even though the folks that had the stories are dead, we want to make sure that all of their stories live for a very long time after they are gone.